Are you going online to replicate an experience that would actually be much better in person? Or are you going to this digital environment to co-experience things you would never be able to experience in the real world?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the CIM Marketing Podcast. And today we are joined by two special guests, one of them all the way from across the pond in the shape of Dr Rhonda Hadi, and one closer to home, Mr Kris Hunt, who joins us from our own shores. Now, Rhonda is Associate Professor of Marketing at Oxford University's Saïd Business School. She is academic expert in the field of marketing, investigating the profound impact of emerging technologies on consumer experiences and behaviour. And for his part, Kris is a Strategy and Creative Director, specialising in building culturally resonant brands in a social-first world. He's worked across global travel, luxury and FMCG brands, shaping brand platforms that live in culture, not just campaigns. His work blends cultural insight, creativity, and commercial impact to build long-term brand meaning. Rhonda, Kris, how are you today?
Happy to be here.
Very good.
It's great to have you both on the show. You know, creativity is the topic of this season's podcast, and this is a perennial question, but no less for it. It's something that I think exercises the minds of marketers and many people actually in the creative industries more widely. Is this rapid technological change that we're experiencing, as useful as it is in some ways, actually empowering brand creativity? Or is it something of a distraction that weakens the emotional impact of human storytelling? And that's the topic we're going to try and get into a little bit today. Rhonda, your research brings together the digital and the physical. Where does creativity lie, do you think, in that gap?
Well, what I think is really interesting is that gap in and of itself between digital and physical is becoming increasingly blurred. So to me, creativity comes from acknowledging that we don't live in this dichotomous world of, okay, now I'm going online or, now I'm offline. I think thinking about it in that way is somewhat counterintuitive or counterproductive rather. And I do see some firms think about, okay, well, what's our digital strategy or what's our AI strategy, as opposed to thinking more fundamentally about customer experience. So traditionally, one big difference between our digital experiences and offline experiences has been the sensory richness associated with our physical world. And when you ask people who strongly prefer physical world experiences, they often refer to things like the smell of fresh air or feeling wind in their face or the hug of a loved one. It almost always comes down to some sort of sensory attribute. But we are seeing technology close that gap because our digital interactions are becoming more visually rich, more auditorily rich, more haptically rich. And I've done a lot of research in these three spaces. We've even seen a lot of explorations into how you can deliver things like scent pretty compellingly via online interactions. So I think creativity comes from not even thinking about that gap, but thinking about how you can deliver the best customer experience, regardless of the platform or technological affordances.
Kris, do you think that's right? Do you think that it's becoming blurred and actually we're starting to get emotional return, a little bit of sensory return from our digital experiences as much as from our physical ones?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting topic around what creativity is. And like Rhonda kind of says, it's always the online versus the real world, where we kind of know that the touch points that consumers actually see are multifaceted, basically. So there's more than one touch point, and it's not just online. And it's happening on pop-ups, which have become really popular with Voxbox, with a lot of brands doing activations in the streets, capturing that content so people don't feel left out. So even if you don't have that true experience with the brand in real life, you can have an element of understanding what the brand was doing. So I think it's more around how do you have that creative flow from one touch point to another, rather than is digital more creative than, say, an activation in real life. I think that's where sometimes it does get blurred around the conversation.
How's your creativity changed? How's that creative breakthrough changed as the tech stack has grown and grown and grown? It's sort of proliferated, hasn't it? The amount of apps, the amount of outlets, the amount of places we can put our content. What's changed in terms of the ways that you express your creativity?
Yeah, I think nowadays everyone wants to try the new thing, and that used to be the great breakthrough. Everything that was basically new, whether it was AI or a different tool that you could use that could really help kind of push that creative breakthrough. But I think nowadays it's a lot more around meaning and the actual creative meaning behind the message. So when you've got so much tech available for marketeers or brands to use, it's quite confusing at first to understand which tool is kind of right for you and where does that sit within, I guess, the marketing campaign. There's a lot of new stuff that's come out. I think last summer or around June time, we had the first kind of AI ad with Kalshi in the US, where they generated basically a 30-second ad in the NBA finals. And it was the first time on a commercial level that people actually got to see the real use of AI at full scale. I think that kind of split people's opinions. So it's taken a while to adjust to, I guess, new technology as well. Even if you use it or the first person to use it as a brand doesn't mean you're going to be successful.
How do you define it, Rhonda? You're obviously from the world of academia, Oxford Saïd, as I said at the top of the show, although joining us from New York today. How do you define it? Do you find that your definition of creativity in the academic world clashes with that the agencies advance as their definition of creativity?
So I wouldn't say it directly clashes, but I do think one potential disconnect is that oftentimes in academia, when we think about creativity, we are thinking about the process and output in terms of things like originality and novelty without necessarily simultaneously considering effectiveness. And I think obviously in the industry, you care about effectiveness, and something can be really creative, but if it is not moving customers, if it's not gathering the attention or conveying the message that you need it to convey, or whatever your KPIs happen to be, then it's not considered a good piece of creative. And so I think perhaps that's one slight difference.
There is the art of it and the science of it, Kris Hunt. The art of it is the artistic creativity. The science of it is that it actually brings a return in terms of visibility, in terms of revenues, all those things that as marketers like. In terms of how tech interacts with that, do you think there's a chance or there is a way in which the advance of tech has actually made creativity more likely to make that return?
Yeah, I mean, ROI is the biggest term used in agency and probably client side as well, especially in terms of kind of the economic struggles that most brands are kind of facing nowadays. So I think it really depends how you position that tech and how you position that creativity, especially within the social world and kind of digesting it. Everything gets broken down to every single piece of content. So everything from the hook to what's the middle part, the story arc, how we've, what's the CTA, everything is almost engineered. And sometimes you can lose that creativity of just where the idea actually started to and what the endpoint actually looks like can be very fast in terms of how that actually comes along. So I think if you're a marketeer, it's just very important to have that creative element kind of being strung through the whole creative message, essentially.
What's changed in terms of that process, Rhonda? You've got a paper out regarding the future of social media. Kris talks about, starting with the creative role that the start as marketers always had. But now when we've got this proliferation of outlets, what's changed in terms of, to use your phrase, the process in which that is delivered?
Well, I think one meaningful change we've been seeing in the marketplace has to do with the nature of the platforms that customers, and particularly young customers, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, are spending their time on. To me, one market shift is movement towards more real-time synchronous platforms, whether that be things like live streams, gaming platforms. To me, they're really gaming plus, because gaming is an element, but a huge element of the popularity of those platforms are the social aspects associated with them and the co-experience with other consumers. And that is markedly different than traditional social media, which was very asynchronous and in many ways designed to reflect what was happening in the offline world. So you might, post a picture of the dinner you went to or your cat, or talk on Twitter or X about, real world events, as opposed to entering an online environment to co-experience in real time with other people. And I think where brands fit in there is a really important conversation to have, because I do think it is markedly different. And some would argue we're moving into more of an experience-based economy online, as opposed to a pure attention-based economy where, ads will just live alongside asynchronous content.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because that speaks to your original point, that actually this idea of a sort of sensory experience, a visceral experience, if you like, which wasn't originally associated with the digital world, is becoming more part and parcel of the digital world, because it's becoming a synchronous experience. You're using digital more and more as a real-time live experience, connecting individuals in the same way that we're having this call here. We're using digital platform to connect ourselves. And that really is an important lesson for marketers. Instead of telling people about the bar you went to, the brand you used, the clothes you bought, things that happened in the near past, you're talking about things that are happening in the present, Kris Hunt, and that's a big shift.
It's a huge shift. And I think that's probably why you've seen a lot of content change in the last few years, and a lot of brands tap creators, influencers, people who actually have a voice online, rather than hosting from the brand platform that exists on, say, social media or different avenues of media. I think people become a little bit wise to being sold to, and this day and age, most people are scrolling, so they will flick through so much content in a single day that if you're not standing out, then that really resonate with them, then you're not really going to stand a chance. And the stuff that really does pull them towards having some sort of emotional connection is, like you've kind of mentioned, is kind of the lived experiences that other people can relate to, rather than brands pushing a single product or service, trying to curate that element.
It's interesting, the signal and the noise. There's a lot of noise out there, but if you can tap in to what Dr. Rhonda Hadi was saying right at the top of the show about that sensory, real lived experience on digital, you can push away your competitors, you can extinguish that noise and become the signal.
Yeah, and I think what you're seeing is two different worlds of people consuming content and marketing nowadays. I think you're going to have that acceleration of live stream and always on, and people watching, live stream, or people who are streaming for like 3 hours long, that work really well in, say, a niche like gaming. But then you're getting an element of society which, the new luxury is being offline. So actually not having a social media presence and having lived experiences. So you're seeing a lot of concerts now, banning the use of cameras or mobile phones at concerts, so people can actually enjoy the experiences and talk about it offline. So I think you're going to have a real shift between kind of how society and cultural elements, and how people actually live through those experiences.
Interesting, this idea of viscerality, Dr. Rhonda Hadi. Some of it is about using these platforms to connect with each other, to create that sensory experience, as you've talked about, rather than leaning into the sort of high-tech nature or the high-tech tools that are available to us. Sometimes you sort of marketing meetings center around, well, just because we've got these gimmicks doesn't mean that we have to use them. Just because these gadgets are available to us doesn't mean we have to use them. Is there a risk, do you think, that sort of availability of high-tech creativity can actually make it harder for consumers to remember the brand message, and that actually, if we can lean into things that are creating experiences and connection, we're more likely to succeed? In fact, going back to basics.
I think that risk is always there with any new technology. I think it can be tempting to want to jump on the bandwagon. I think some brands have real FOMO about not wanting to be the last to embrace a certain technology and to go along with the hype. Certainly, I think that risk is always there. But I think if used correctly, new platforms and technologies can be incredibly liberating and usher in a whole new wave of creativity. To me, one classic example of this, if we look back at more traditional mediums, is when television first came out. Early TV was essentially men sitting at desks talking into a microphone, because that's what radio was. And so it's like, okay, this is what TV is. And it wasn't until much later that we found artists and creatives and content creators really taking advantage of the medium and more advanced cinematography, etc. And so I think that that's the case with any platform. With a new platform, ideally, there would be new affordances and leaps we can take creatively. However, if we're just using that just for the sake of using the platform and not to actually add value or bring anything meaningfully new, then I think that's a waste of time and money.
I've got in my notes here, I don't mind telling our audience, this one word line, metaverse, which kind of speaks to your point, is that we remember the metaverse. You might remember it. Many would want to forget it. And this became a sort of obsession in marketing for a defined period of time in which the technology for the metaverse became available, and everyone was told to develop content that lent into that obsession, that lent into the availability of the metaverse. The rest, of course, is history, and it's not a particularly happy history. How do we avoid that happening again, Dr. Rhonda? How do we avoid, a new technology becoming available and then the industry diving headfirst into it, and perhaps the casualty being creativity, narrative, and brand value?
To me, what's really interesting about that case study is that many of the technologies supporting the metaverse, and in many ways, this idea of co-experiencing content with others in real time, remotely, are very much still a big thing. I think to me, the distinguishing feature is, are you going online to replicate an experience that would actually be much better in person? Or are you going to this digital environment to co-experience things you would never be able to experience in the real world, including some of these gaming context, adventures, scenes that, particularly depending on your own physical abilities or financial abilities, may not be a reality to you in the physical world. And so I think, if you look at the size of, just the gaming industry, it's larger than the music and film, the media industries combined. So it's just huge, huge. And I think it's largely ignored because we don't understand it. I do think there's also a generational divide there. So I had an MBA student who in class, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, mentioned that he was the best man in a wedding. And that was the first time he met the groom in person, was at the wedding. But They were absolutely best friends because they had spent hours and hours and hours on these gaming platforms talking. They knew all about each other's lives. It was unquestionable that they were best friends and that, of course, he would be the best man in his wedding. And I think there are people in the room who totally got that, and people in the room who were shocked by that and couldn't imagine without having that physical content you could develop such a close bond to somebody.
Which camp are you in, Kris Hunt? Would you be in the shot camp or the sanguine camp about being a best man at a wedding with people you'd never met?
I don't think it's totally weird. I mean, I've been in the gaming space as well when I was a teenager. So I used to run matches and clans with Americans and people all over the world, and you're managing people's lives. And then at the same time, you're going to a science lesson. So it's not totally weird. But I think in the case of like the metaverse, I think it's probably the right tech. It's probably just the wrong timing within society. And I think if there's anything that they probably learn is that platforms can't force culture on people. You can have all the technology, all the infrastructure, obviously the trillions that were invested into it. But if the culture's not there and it doesn't emerge from people who choose to care about the tech, then you've only rented that attention only for a small while and eventually kind of die down. I think that's what we kind of saw with Meta and the metaverse, and them basically chopping back on the actual technology. But what we have seen is probably livable and wearable tech come fruition. I remember years ago, maybe like 8 or 10 years ago, everyone was talking about tech, rain jackets and all of this, and it was just the wrong timing. And none of that really came to life. But nowadays, everyone is tracking every element of their life, from, having wearable rings or fitness bracelets, to Apple Watches, to monitoring heart rate, to everything that they can basically put a data point on. And it's become the next big thing. So I think the metaverse will come round again, but I don't think it's just at this time or this place at the moment.
Is a lesson then, Rhonda, that not to be an early adopter full stop, or to be a little bit cautious about adopting a new technology or something else?
I think the answer really comes down to what value is this adding? And so I think if you're becoming an early adopter of a new technology just for the sake of becoming an early adopter, then that's much more of a tech demo than creating content that's actually memorable or meaningful to your audience. And so, if using this new technology or platform allows you to do something that touches your audience in a way that you can't do on other platforms, then that's a no-brainer. If that's where they are and that's, the best conduit for that message, wonderful. But you shouldn't just be seeking out that medium for the sake of, being a first mover or even an early mover to the platform if there's no value add there.
Absolute golden advice. But marketers often complain that actually what happens in their organizations is that the tech team procure a new platform or new technology and then tell the marketers to use it. How do you get around that? If you either don't have any use for it at all, or you're not clear what value its use would bring as a marketer or a marketing team?
I think with technology being forced onto, say, employees or within marketing teams or any sort of teams, I think we're living through an element of that right now with everything being AI. I think the amount of times that people have just gone, can you just uninstall it and go back to what I already had? Or is this really benefiting anyone?
Yeah.
That I think that's every business is going to face that challenge one way or another. And it really comes down to maybe more of the culture or the experimentation or how you approach marketing within the business rather than what's been implemented by a certain team or procurement or because there's a deal done. I think the more question is how you're bringing value out of that tech, essentially.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the few learnings here is, first of all, don't be led by the platform. Don't be led by the technology. Be led by your creativity, then find the right technology for it. But also on the other side of the ledger, which goes back to Rhonda's initial brilliant point, is that accept that digital space and digital media can now and does evoke physical feelings. It involves sensory feelings. It involves lived experience. And actually, that sounds to me like what we should be aiming for. So, let's dive into that a little bit more, Rhonda. What do we need to do as marketers? What are the techniques that we can use to evoke physical feelings, physical connection, if you like, or at least mental connection through our digital work?
Every new technology has different affordances. And to me, the one that most literally represents this blurring of digital and physical is augmented reality. And I think oftentimes when people talk about augmented reality or AR, they conflate it with virtual reality and they think of the headsets. And when actually they're completely different technologies, both in terms of practically and theoretically, because whereas virtual reality is meant to remove you from your current world and supplant you into a completely synthetic environment, augmented reality is the kind of literal visual coexistence of physical and virtual. So using, any device camera to see content that is, a digital artifact, either on yourself, on your physical self, via, filters on, Snapchat, Instagram, etc., or to see content in your space or even in public spaces. And that to me is the most literal coexistence or blurring of digital and physical. And I think that is fascinating, particularly from a psychological point of view, where we think evolutionarily, we've always known we need to pay closer attention and give more care to content or people who are in our proximal space. And so when objects or content or people feel like they're in our physical space, even if they're not, I do think that triggers a certain sense of intimacy and empathy, which is fascinating and I think has been really underexplored to date.
That is absolutely fascinating, to blend the physical and the digital together through AR, augmented reality, helps us develop these, what we're looking for, which is the mental connection, the physical feeling, the stimulus, if you like, through digital work that we once claimed we could only experience through pure play physical experiences. Kris, when you're working, how do you ensure a creative idea, which, say, begins in the physical space, a big billboard, for example, can then be converted and made effective into a digital space or a quasi-digital space, the sorts of things that Rhonda's been describing?
Yeah, I think if you start with a single, simple idea that can be expressed at different levels, then I think it works, especially if the creative can attach to different formats, should they kind of flex, or different ways to actually access that content. But the meaning shouldn't really change in terms of what that idea is about. Otherwise, if it needs like over explanation or, too much steps in the process, especially with the technology behind it, then it becomes really fragile and it doesn't really work. I think what we're seeing where the tech is coming to life is especially sports nowadays. I think there's been a lot of activations, especially with AR on mobile phones, whether it's sort of like Snapchat filters or on TV screens. I think now even Sky Sports are experimenting where you can see the data points of, how fast the footballer kicked the football into the back of the goal, or, the positioning. So I think we're seeing a lot of that come to life now, a lot more than we used to. So I think fans and people who engage with a lot of sports want that extra element. So I think, that technology really helps elevate the content that's kind of being presented to them.
Do you think you can ever get to a point where pure digital work can match the creative impact and the sensory impact of a physical, tactile brand activation? Is that possible, do you think?
Interesting question. I think it depends on the preference of the consumer or the user in that instance. I think a lot of people prefer one thing or another. Some, prefer to switch off when they get home, whereas others use technology or social media nowadays that's their way of switching off. So I think it really comes down to how people interact with content, and not everyone's going to interact the same way. I think a lot of people confuse, we just have one touch point within a creative campaign and that's it. We expect all of our target audience to interact how we basically programmed it or, explained how it will operate. But reality is people are distracted. They're getting on with their daily lives. They're one eye on a screen, one eye on another thing. So I don't think it doesn't really come to fruition as how marketers might see it on a board in a room to what happens actually in reality.
Rhonda, do you think we can ever get to a position where pure play digital can maximize the impact and experience of physical or mixed creative work?
So I think the very phrasing of that question carries with it this implication that there's a certain primacy or superiority of our physical world. And can we ever replicate that in the digital realm without acknowledging that for many people and in many ways, digital platforms can allow us to do things you can't do in the physical world, right? And vice versa. And I think that's where Kris has alluded to this a lot. It's really important to think about individual differences and different audiences and where they're getting value. Or there is this beautiful film on Netflix called The Remarkable Life of Ibelin. It's a Norwegian documentary about this boy who grew up with a pretty severe form of muscular dystrophy. And his parents were always sort of worried he's missing out on life. And he passes pretty young, maybe around the age of 20, 25. And then they discovered, because he had left passwords to his different platforms, they discovered he had this very full life and all of these friends and connections who reached out to him afterwards, and all of these things he was doing in this community he built that he really would not have been able to build in the physical world. And so I think it's really important to sort of take a more neutral stance when it comes to that distinction between physical and digital, and not necessarily assuming one has primacy over the other, and recognizing that each has its strengths and weaknesses.
It's a great point, but we live and we're born in the physical world, Chris Hunt, but we shouldn't necessarily see the digital world, the virtual world, as subordinate in some way. And if we do, we're making a fundamental error.
Yeah, I think you can find a lot of research online where, it says you need around 11 to 13 touch points before a consumer actually converts. Yeah. So even if you take in social media and website, that's only 2 touch points for that user. So I think you have to mix the real world and the digital world. Otherwise, you will alienate a few people from having that brand experience that you're trying to get across.
It's interesting. You touched on it before. I mean, while we're sort of leaning into it a little bit here when we're talking about digital, no CIM podcast in the modern day would be complete without having a little bit of a discussion about AI. We did a whole season on it last time. You touched upon it earlier, Kris, when you were talking about, AIs of various shades and colors being introduced into businesses, and sometimes marketing departments saying, look, can you just uninstall this because we can't see the value of it. Nevertheless, a lot of AI does quicken our jobs, let's be honest about it. There's a danger AI and similar technologies, though, are making us more productive as marketers, but less creative.
I'm not sure if it's more productive. I mean, I haven't found a tool yet that can really completely overhaul a marketing department. I think there's a lot of elements that can help speed up certain things like ideation, copywriting, but it's never to overtake the real job of the creative element. I think you still need brains in the room because the human is only going to be able to understand another human's pain points and different cultural preferences and nuances by living. And I don't think there's an AI yet, before maybe AGI comes along, that has that nuance capability to really understand what's happening in the daily world and why there is that friction point, or why is that emotion being, coming through a certain society. So as much data as you can input into an AI system, there's nothing that's going to replicate, say, 4 or 5 creative people in a room to actually get that campaign live. So I think it's not there yet, maybe in the future, but I think right now, I think there's just elements which are helping speed up certain aspects of marketing, but I don't think it's really taken over the creative arm.
What are the big tools, Rhonda, if not the off-the-shelf AIs? What are the big tools for creatives that they can lean into, which are actually going to expand, less about expanding productivity or speed and more about expanding creativity, or unlimiting or reducing the shackles on human creativity?
I think the value that comes from AI tools is it automates things for us. And some of those tasks really are very mechanical, sometimes mundane tasks. And those it can speed up. But I think the question is, what are you losing by using AI to do certain tasks? Are you relying on AI for ideation, meaning you are no longer in a group setting, tossing around ideas with colleagues, etc.? Are you no longer engaging in any independent thought because you're completely relying on AI to come up with all of the new ideas? Or are you using these tools as an agent to help toss ideas around, soundboard? You can sort of think about the analogy of a group setting, how if you're trying to come up with a creative idea in a certain group setting, you might end up with groupthink and a reduced amount of creativity, or you might end up with this idea generation that's much more than the sum of its parts, and again, bouncing ideas off of each other, etc. So I think the way that we use the tools are probably more important than the tools in and of themselves.
Interesting. What's the soft skill, the soft human skill then, that creative professionals need to protect as tech takes over some of this mundane, hard routine stuff that Rhonda's been talking about?
I think it comes down to having taste and almost ability to curate and edit and know when not to do something. Because I think it's quite easy to kind of lean in and use tech or use AI nowadays, which gives you almost quite a bland answer. I mean, interestingly enough, I'm the top 5% user of ChatGPT in the world. But I would never use it for strategy because it's so bad at it. So I think you really have to understand when not to do something. And that comes from your years of experience of being, going through all the bumps and humps and challenges that you've kind of endeavored with different brands to really understand markets. That if you just put that into an AI, I think you would always get some sort of answer, but I don't think that necessarily means it's the right direction. So I think taste and curation is kind of the unfair advantage that humans have of understanding like that cultural difference that's really going to turn people to kind of listen and, pay attention to what you're trying to come across.
Interesting. Taste and discernment, Rhonda Hadi, are our unfair advantages.
I think it comes down to judgment. And the analogy I think of as an academic is you move from being just an author to really the editor. So you're going to have all this content that's coming at you, and it's up to you to really have that higher level judgment of, is this good? Is this appropriate? Does this make sense given my context and knowledge? I think one risk is if you are relying on AI before you were an author to begin with, then, maybe you're skipping steps, and have you actually developed the, innate knowledge to be a good judge of content? But that's a very different story.
It's an interesting story, though. It's an interesting point. It may lead into your final advice. I'm going to press you for your final sort of 20-second piece of advice, which we always try to make this practical, a practical outcome, if you like, of these shows. What's the one practical step, speaking to the world's marketeers as you are now, to make a creative strategy more resilient as text grows and grows and grows and grows over the next half decade, the next 5 years?
I think you have to build your strategy around human truths and not around platforms. So what I mean by that is platforms constantly change. And we've kind of seen that in the past where Twitter's become X, or some platforms like Facebook have, not really kind of died out against a certain demographic like Gen Z. So I think if you kind of position yourself around just focusing on the tech and the platform, then it's going to be quite a hard time for the brand or the creative to actually adjust with culture and nuance and new things coming around, because there's always going to be something new that's around the corner. So I think if you can really home in on the human truths, and I think you can really push what that memory of that brand to your target audience.
The tech's ever growing, Rhonda Hadi. The human truths are evergreen.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Kris's points there. I teach a core marketing course for our MBA students, and the entire first lesson is dedicated to customer centricity and the importance of understanding human insight and needs. And that should be the starting point of everything that comes next, as opposed to, the sort of shiny new toy syndrome and just jumping on a bandwagon for the sake of jumping on that bandwagon. I think it's easy to forget that tools like AI are largely trained on content that comes from our online interactions. And there's a lot of content there, and these tools are really impressive. But there's also a lot, and this is sort of almost the antithesis of everything we've talked about so far. There's also so much unique insight that happens off of these platforms that those LLMs will never really get. There are entire audiences and geographies that are largely ignored, and there's so much offline physical experience that really isn't embedded into those systems. Human judgment, at least until now, reigns supreme.
Dr. Rhonda Hadi, Kris Hunt, thank you very much indeed. Great having you on the show. You can find detailed show notes and links to additional resources mentioned by our guests at cim.co.uk/content-hub/podcast. Please consider supporting the show by leaving a rating and review. The CIM Marketing Podcast is hosted by me, Ben Walker, and produced for CIM by Brindley Walker, no relation. Thanks again for tuning in to the CIM Marketing Podcast. We'll catch you next time.
Looking for more ways to learn and upskill? CIM members can register now for our upcoming member-exclusive webinars. More details available on the Content Hub. The contents and views expressed by individuals in the CIM Marketing Podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the companies they work for.